But I think the first thing that I'm interested to know is if you personally think that it's possible to be a good conductor without being, without having professional chops at, in an instrumental way, without being professionally capable as some other kind of instrumentalist.
That's a really good question. I'm really not sure. All I can say is almost all of the great conductors were virtuosos at some level of their instruments. So, but I do know some really good conductors who are not and never have been, but they have perspicacity and an ability to really look into a score and really study it and figure out what they want to do with it and what the composer wants them to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you have to have an analytic mind and musical skills. I don't think you necessarily need to be able to go out and play concerts on any given instrument or sing, especially. I can't think of any great conductors who came from being singers, but there might have been one or two at some point. But there, in opera, there's a huge number that came through being coaches and accompanist.
Yeah, I know maybe Natalie Stutzman is conducting more and more.
Oh, I had no idea. That's interesting. Okay.
Was Rene Jacobs a singer first?
That's right. He was a countertenor. Yeah.
Countertenor. But yeah, I find it strikes me as it would be a challenge to come in any other route than as a communicator of music, some kind of
exactly.
Music.
Also, conducting is a real technique, and it's not like you can just have ideas and then put it on people. You've got to have a gestural vocabulary or develop a gestural vocabulary and see what works, and be open to what you hear, and then change accordingly, to have a vocabulary of gestures that you can use. And that doesn't come quickly necessarily. And it does do better if you've had experience in the pit.
Yeah. Now, I know that you work often as a coach for singers and somebody who's educating singers. But in terms of the conducting education, how do you think about passing on skills to younger conductors, or even like communicating the craft of it?
How do I think about it? Well, I think it's important. If you've got somebody who's interested in learning, there's nothing more fun. I've had a number of assistants through the years, and some have gone on and done really great things, and those were always the ones that were looking to grow and looking to learn. So if there were times when it was the end of rehearsal and I was really exhausted, or I just wanted to see their conducting chops, I would let them do it and I would watch, and I would ask if would they like some feedback. And the ones who did are the ones who are having careers. And what I do is not always applicable to other people, but what I would do is the same thing I do with singers. I'd say, this is what I see, or this is what I'm hearing. Is this what your intent was? So that's often the best way to work with somebody, I think.
And what do you find are the most common deficiencies of somebody who says, I want to be a conductor, and they just start, they get up in front of an orchestra?
I think not doing their homework, or thinking that they know more than they do. I definitely fell into that category because there's this common misinformation, fake news, whatever, that conductors are born and not made, which isn't true at all. There is a technique and it can be learned, but there are a lot of famous conductors from the past who would just shut the door and say, oh, nobody ever taught me anything. I just knew how to do it, or I did it and people responded. And it's a total lie. I mean, 100% of the time, there is a technique that can be learned and it can be taught. And it's like before around 1990, if you read any great singer's autobiography, they only talk about their successes, and that they started singing and then everyone wanted them and they sang all over the world and this and that, and no one would ever admit to having had any failures or challenges or difficulties. The person who actually broke that, who was actually honest, was Renee Fleming.
Right.
Her autobiography, who actually had the courage to talk about her disappointments and how she either dealt with them or tried to deal with them, and the challenges in her career, and that everything did not go smoothly from their first performance. So it's the same with conductors. I think these other conductors, for their own personal reasons or their personal aggrandizement, led people to believe that they just were brilliant and then they did it and they had this gift and no one else has it. But it's not really the way it works. Most conductors had to learn by having orchestras pissed off at them.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I find, I don't know, you correct me if I'm wrong in this, but I think of conductors existing on a scale. On one side, you have people that are very much about communicating specifically with their hands, that the gestures, how they communicate information, what they want, is precise and is really in the stick technique, or whatever
Clear
you want to call it. And then on the other side of the spectrum is something more abstract, about personality and energy in ways that like charisma and something more kinetic, less specific in the stick, but more about the human energy in front of the orchestra. Am I wrong in thinking that?
No, you're right. But I think that the latter example that you're giving is largely because somebody decided that they're not going to learn the technique, or they haven't learned it. And it ultimately gets the orchestra members really angry because they've spent a whole career, decades working 8 hours a day on their craft, learning how to communicate with their instrument. But with the conductor, your instrument, it's a nonverbal communication, and your instrument are your hands, and usually with a stick. So orchestra members would get really angry that the conductor is not doing what's expected, what was expected of them individually. So I don't think there really is any excuse for not being able to communicate with your hands. So the reason I found out is because I was one of those people who thought I just had the charisma and this great musical idea, and started conducting and talked my way into some gigs where I was ill-equipped and really not ready. Luckily, it was before internet, and I was off the radar. And I remember getting feedback from orchestra members, anonymous feedback. They had to fill out forms. And there was one gig I had where almost everybody said, he seems like a really nice guy. When he talks, he seems like a really wonderful musician, but he has no technique and we don't know what the hell he's trying to do.
Right.
So I thought that's never going to happen again. And then I got down and searched out and auditioned a bunch of teachers until I found someone who could really help me learn what I needed to learn, so that would never happen again.
Who was that person?
Well, her name is Marcia LaRue. She's a great teacher. She had a good career as a conductor, mostly in Colorado, until there was a lot of, she ran up against the issue of being a woman conductor. So she left the profession in a lot of frustration, but she was a great teacher. She taught me technically everything I needed to know, until another gig a few years down the line. The feedback I got was that I didn't give the orchestra any room to do what they wanted to do. I was too exacting and too clear all the time, that I need to somehow loosen things up so that they could contribute what they wanted to contribute. So I'd gone from one extreme of not knowing what to do to actually taking iron fist control, and which was not appreciated either. And so I think over the years I've learned how to, by and large, give what they need, but it's got to be a collaboration. And the most important thing for a conductor or any musician is to have a collaborative spirit and love the music.
Right. It also sounds like something that's very important is being able to hear honest feedback from people and have some kind of willingness to improve yourself. Yeah,
that's for singers, for everybody. I mean, growth is the best opportunity we have as human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you feel like, you'll know what I mean by this question, but that you're the same conductor for every kind of repertoire that you conduct, be it standard or contemporary? Because there is some kinds of contemporary music that requires an exacting approach because of just the sheer challenge of creating ensemble. But there's also some kinds of music that when you open up, that allow for more openness and more bloom, or whatever you want to say. And
can I jump back to the previous topic for a second?
Sure.
Because yesterday when I was cleaning my house, I was listening to a podcast with Terry Gross and Sanjay Gupta, who's a neuroscientist and a neurosurgeon. And he was talking about brain function. And he said that people people can grow throughout their lives, and there's no reason for your brain function to fall apart over time unless you don't challenge it. I think so. He was saying that being willing to challenge yourself is really the key to keeping your brain nimble and fresh. So I think for all human activities and for everyone, I think it's a really at all ages. So there's an attitude behind that I think is vital for singers, for all instrumentalists, for all people. So you had a question about conducting contemporary music versus standard repertoire, or?
Do you sort of bring the same approach to the whole variety?
Well, the priorities are a little bit different. When you're conducting contemporary things that are really complicated rhythmically, the orchestra's looking at you not so much for gesture and color or anything. They just want you to keep them together. They need to know where to play and where not to play. So if you can't give them that, then you shouldn't be conducting it. Basically, you shouldn't be conducting anything. Your job is to let people know what's expected of them and be able to give them the information to accomplish that. So that's why in rehearsal, I try and do the same thing with singers, is in a gentle way as possible. I tried to discuss with them before rehearsals, what we're trying to achieve. But then I try and let everyone know what my expectations are, so that, and then I reward them with applause or whatever when they do it. And then if I'm displeased, then they actually know why. What I've asked of them that they're either unwilling or not, or unable to do. If they're unwilling, I hope that I've established a sort of vibe that they can actually talk to me and tell me why they're unwilling. If they're to say, no, this goes against my vocal technique, I buy that entirely. In that case, I say, well, what can I do to help?
Right.
So actually, I even talk about that in my book. There's a little chapter about how to talk to conductors. And you talk about musical things and always try and be a partner. If the singer comes to a conductor and says, oh, maestro, I really need your help here. If the conductor's a real shit, he's not going to listen. But there are very few conductors who are not good people. Conductors want to make for great music, want to make a good performance, and have a collaboration. So if you start out with that approach, I really need your help here, the conductor will 99 times out of 100 will say, oh, what can I do to help? What is it you need? So it's a good approach, in the same way that I will say to the singer, I really need you to look at me here, so we arrive together on the downbeat of this tempo change, whatever. That's just an example. So I think, again, that's a matter of expectations. Then I can stop and say, in rehearsal, I won't embarrass them. I'll stop and say, I said I needed you to look at me here. You didn't do it. Can you do it? Let's do it now. So, and of course, they have good reasons for not doing it, usually because they're thinking about 98 other things, how to walk and how to sing and do the right whatever technically and do the right words. So I get it that they're overloaded, but I just need them to know what my priorities are and what my needs are to be able to do my job. And I need to know what their needs are for them to do their job. So jumping on to another topic that you and I may have discussed before, I remember when it was Leonard Bernstein, back when I was a kid, who was the one who encouraged me more than that. He demanded that I become a conductor. And I was very put off by the idea, because I was at that point a pianist and didn't envision myself at all as a conductor. I said, well, if I do decide to pursue this in any way, what advice do you give? His advice was, get the best people and then let them do their job. So that's essentially what I've done. I mean, it's great advice. So that's what I do. But there's also the issue of when somebody doing their job conflicts with somebody else doing their job, then somehow you've got to sort that out, or just say who's going to be in charge in each situation. But so I think my job is to let other people do their jobs, and there are places where I feel that their job is to help me do mine.
Yeah.
And the orchestra feels the same way. They want to see from me when to play first. That's the first priority, when to play, and then how to play. That might be the color, it might be the articulation, it might be the dynamics, and you've got to be able to show that all in your hands at the same time.
Yeah.
One of my favorite conductors is a guy named Carlos Kalmar, who was the conductor of the Oregon Symphony. He just retired from that position recently after many years. I was his assistant in Aix-en-Provence when I was in my late 20s. And I remember saying that he was like, what's the name of the Indian god with 20 arms? Goddess, I believe it is.
Um,
I can't remember.
Yeah.
In any case, it doesn't matter. But I felt that that's what he was, because there was always one hand showing dynamics, another hand showing articulation, another hand. So it was remarkable, and it was never confusing. So that's the thing. And there's got to be a level of priorities. The first priority is when to play, and then the next is how to play. And the how can change all the time. It can change what the priority is. The priority could be articulation, the priority could be color, the priority could be dynamics, any of these things. And also, there's got to be enough rhythmic flexibility, enough flexibility in one's technique that if the singer needs to do X, Y, or Z, that you're with them, and that you can also hear it and anticipate. I remember a few years ago, James Levine saying Rossini was the hardest composer to conduct of all, because the singers, in order to do their job, they might feel that all of a sudden they need to do something a little faster and in one breath to make it through. Or they might suddenly need to take an extra breath, and somehow the conductor has got to be on the same wavelength and hear what they're going to do and respond accordingly and tell the 50 to 90 people in front of them how to do it. Not tell them, but show them.
Right.
It's a nonverbal communication. Yeah.
I've always, the thing that's always been interesting is how do you establish coherence? Because I studied conducting a little bit when I was in conservatory, and you get up in front of an ensemble, and when you're trying to, keep a group of musicians hanging together, you're sort of, as you say, you're prioritizing when and where. There's something about rhythm, and you're trying to train your hands to show pattern, I guess. But that's just level one. You have to start to bring in color, tone, dynamics, all of these other pieces of information, but you only have two hands.
Right.
You have this constant flow of time. And there's something about the intuitive way that you flex out of time and start to telegraph other things that you want, how you have to prioritize if you have an entrance that's very hard for somebody, how your brain has to switch over into that function and be there. But then when do you come back into something that's about sound shape or something that's about dynamics? And as someone who is very unskilled at it, I found it that I would want to very quickly move away from the time part of it and get into the shape and get into the,
this fun, thing. For sure.
It's more fun, but I couldn't do it in a way that was coherent. They wouldn't
stay together.
Yeah, I would do that, and all of a sudden it would fall apart underneath me. So there's something about but there's no A to B path of how to gain that, or it seemed to me that way, other than really truly developing coherence within your own technique or something.
Yeah, I remember I developed, my teacher demanded me to develop lots of simultaneity, so that I remember her saying, okay, you've now learned how to keep everybody together to let people know when to play. Now add the dynamics onto it with just your right hand.
Yeah.
Okay, now you've shown me the dynamics and when to play. Now show me the articulation, show me the syncopations as well. So finally, a few years later, I felt that my left hand didn't have as much control as my right. So I had a few lessons with another teacher, a great teacher and a great guy, who said, Neal, the problem is that you're putting everything in your right hand. You're giving too much information in one hand and not enough in the other. He said, take out some of the stuff, take out this and this and this that you're putting in the right hand and show that in your left while you do the other, while you just show when to play in your right. So that was good. I mean, it was sort of scary because I had to learn a whole additional technique, but one learns and one grows.
Yeah. I'm interested, what do you think, I know because of how frequently you're working with singers, what do you think is the thing that is most missing from vocal training these days? What are the problems that you encounter most frequently that you wish voice teachers would spend time really addressing and training singers?
Well, those are two different things. There's what the singers need to address, and then what the teachers need to address.
Interesting. Tell me.
The big thing is that singers have got to know what it is they want to communicate. the whole purpose of technique is for them to be able to communicate what they want to communicate.
Right.
So the first issue is being able to not only decide, but to be able to articulate for yourself what you want to communicate, both on a global level and at a smaller level.
Right.
So the job of the teacher is to give somebody the technique to be able to communicate what they want, what they feel that they need to communicate. And that's should be everything. I remember working with this fabulous singer in Germany today. And I said, do you actually want that high A to be as loud as you did it? She said, let me think about that. And so she thought, and she said, no, I don't think it should be. And I said, well, let's do it again. And let's see if you can do it the way that you want to do it. Now that you've decided how you want to do it. She couldn't quite bring it off. And I said, okay, so let's technically figure out what you need to be doing and what you're doing to go against what you need to be doing. So we figured that out, and then she did it, and she said, I love that. It feels good, and it sounds good, and it communicates what I want it to communicate. So I think most of this is, but unless you know what you what you want to communicate, you can't achieve it, of course.
Right.
And excuse me, it should always be musical goals. It should never be just, oh, I want to be able to do this great high A, this great pianissimo high A. Because your high A has got to communicate something rather than just beauty, unless it's going to be totally vapid and uninteresting.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there should be an emotional concept and emotional architecture that a singer needs to come up with in order to make a coherent and really fabulous performance. And it's the job of the teacher to give them the tools to be able to accomplish this.
Do you find that most singers walk into your studio with a sense of that communication is at the root of it?
No, hardly anyone does,
right.
Because they're too busy worrying about their technique. I remember I was teaching a class at Manus. I think it was just last year before the lockdown. I said, so I judge a lot of competitions. I said, we who are at the table, what do you think that we're looking for when you come in to sing at these auditions? And hands came up immediately. And the first person said, a perfect technique. And I said, actually, none of us are looking for a perfect technique. I said, so it took a long time because singers, that's what they're focused on I can't say all the time, but as students, generally that's what they're focused on. But it's not what audiences respond to. It's not what judges respond to. What we respond to is music making and the communication of emotions. So that's basically what my book is about. That's really what I try to get people to think that way, and then go ahead and do it. You may know a really wonderful coach accompanist at the Met named Dan Saunders, who I've known since we were students together in London. And I remember him telling me that he would wake up in the morning around 8, and then he would get all the scores he was working on and lay it in front of him in the bed and go through and decide how it needed to sound and how it needed to be. And then he would get up eventually and get himself ready and then do what he'd practiced to find a way to accomplish that. And that really was good food for thought. So I really owe him a debt of thanks for that.
Interesting. I find it, to be such a hard thing to, it's almost like a very high level of practice to be able to walk into a professional situation and feel the agency to bring your own sense of communication to the room, especially when so much of your training is being told that, you have to onboard the opinions of this coach or this conductor or this director, but in fact, the thing that everyone is really looking for is to have some kind of collaboration in art making that
Mm-hmm.
the singer walks into the room with, that says, I come with this sensibility of this, and nothing is rote. Nothing is just about the act of doing it. It's all in service. And so if the idea needs to change, the technique can change with it.
Right, exactly. That's the purpose of technique. At the end of the book, there's interviews with, I think, 7 different singers. And the one thing that they all do not agree about is the level at which you need to enter rehearsal with everything thought out or
Right.
all the decisions made. Some of them feel that's really counterproductive because then you get too fixed. What they all thought is that you need to consider as many options as you're studying a piece as possible, emotional options, and then how that would be translated into music making, and just you got to trust that you've got enough technique to do it. So some of them said that they don't make any decisions until they get with the conductor and especially the stage director.
Mm.
Others said that they find it much better to consider everything, make a decision, go in and do that decision, and then wait until somebody disagrees.
Mm-hmm.
So you pointed out something interesting that also relates to being a conductor, because as you know, conductors can't really rehearse. You rehearse when you go in for rehearsals, but you can't develop your craft unless you can hire string quartets or hire pianists, whatever. But even then, especially then, actually, at all levels, it's important to have the humility to say, I'm really not getting what I want. What can you help me? What is it I need to do to communicate that better?
Mm-hmm.
So I remember saying that to an orchestra, and I remember one of my former teachers, not this great teacher, not Marcia, had said to me, "You can't show any vulnerability for an orchestra because then they won't respect you anymore."
Mm-hmm.
But I remember saying, and I thought that was not true because they're human beings too, so they don't need iron authority. They want to make music. So I remember saying, "I'm not getting the color I'm looking for. Is it because you're not doing this with the bow, or is it because of this and this?" And I said, "So in the future, what can my shortcut be?" And people raised their hands, and at break, they would come and talk to me and demonstrate things. And they were really happy. They were thrilled that I wanted their help too. So a collaborative attitude is really, really important.
I find that all the time as a director, that because so much about authority you assume is about somehow this oversized personality. And I think I've worked for plenty of directors who choose to perform a sense of authority, in the room. This is the way it goes. And if you don't do it my way, I get to throw a fit. And
right, my way or the highway.
And that was something that always terrified me, because my inherent energy in the world is not that. That's not, what I found with those types of people is there is a sort of, they get away with it because somehow the performance is honest. Like they are that same person in real life, or they, that sense of oversized power, authority, kind of iron fist. People, I guess, believe it when it's demonstrated in the room. But for me, I would, it's like if I tried to do that, people would laugh at me. They would say that isn't at all authentic to who you are as a person.
Yeah, it's also because you're so young, you probably can't get away with it so much. But my big question is, if you come in with that attitude and are that sort of inflexible and demanding, how can anyone who's working with you feel that they've got any skin in the game?
Yeah.
Feel that they have any investment in the results?
I guess I personally have worked for directors who treat stage craft as like painting, right? They're the painter and the singers are the paint. The production is the canvas. And so what really, what is happening is that there's this individual perspective that sits at the front of the room and tells people what to do, where to go. And that, I guess they have the sense that they're blending into this larger vision that they themselves can't see because they're a part of it. And so there is some sense of turning yourself over to that.
Well, you've got to be willing to do that too. But I do differentiate, again, I'm keep coming back to my book. I'm sorry about that.
Please.
But early on, I differentiate between puppet singers versus artist singers.
Sure.
So artist singers are the ones who come in having thought about all of these things, really having thought about what the music's doing, what it is they're trying to communicate on the basis of what's on the page, both the text and the music. And those are the ones who actually, if they know how to talk to conductors and how to talk to directors, they immediately get respect and get rehired all the time, whether their technique or their instrument is really capable of doing, bringing about what their ideas are, achieving their musical and artistic goals. And then there are the puppet singers who might have a fabulous technique and a fabulous voice, and they just come in and say, tell me what to do and I'll do it. But that's not really interesting for the conductor or the director because there's no collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel the same way?
I do. I think, yeah, I think I do feel that way. I think that what you want is somebody that's engaged, you know, and engagement almost always means that if you are come into a process and wait for everyone to tell you what to do, you're not actually engaged in the process.
Exactly. We were introduced by our mutual friend and mentor, Robin Guarino. And I remember working with her in a rehearsal, her saying, okay, at some point, this character starts here and ends up here. When do you think they start moving, and why? And so show me, just do it and do what you think is appropriate for the situation and what the character is experiencing and going through. And that inevitably worked much better than if she had said, now this is when you do this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the challenge of when you're doing a remount of a production and somebody's holding a book that says move here now,
mm-hmm.
because that would have worked for singer A, whereas it won't work for singer B.
I always think about that because I have to do some amount of remounting, but you know, my take on it is always, you know, certain choreography has to happen because lights are focused in certain directions, you know, or a set piece has to do this, you know, and but in terms of the actual staging, you know, you know, what happens internally has to be organic to the room itself, which is, I think, what you're saying. You know, you sort of have to find a reason why you know, reanimate every piece of blocking, or else it will feel like you've done something paint by numbers. It won't have any sense of organic, you know, energy to it. So yeah, I completely agree.
And then on top of it, there are also some sorts of considerations that are outside of the music that are really valid. I remember I was conducting Magic Flute at New York City Opera, and there's a march in there, and I decided that every time I've heard it, it's too fast. It doesn't make any sense. It didn't have any gravitas,
mm-hmm.
and it didn't work for the piece. And I remember doing it in rehearsal, and someone from management was there, luckily, and came up to me afterwards and said, I love what you're doing with that march. I've never heard it that way. It's wonderful, but you can't do that. I said, why can't I do that? He said, because it will go overtime, right, and we'll have to pay and union rates, double union rates, whatever. And I hadn't thought of that. He said, so just get on with it. I know I know you think it's better that way, and it probably is better that way, but just don't do it.
It's a business after all, you know?
Yeah, it is a business. And so I knew that if I did it the way that I felt it, I'd never be rehired. So that is also a consideration too.
Yeah. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and just jump around. Am I right? You spent your early life on the West Coast?
No. I'm from Michigan.
You're from Michigan, but you went to college in Oregon.
Right. I went to college in Oregon because my piano teacher moved.
Oh, interesting. So you went to Reed College, right?
Right.
And you got a degree in music.
Right. I got a degree in music, but it was academic music. It was more the musicological side of music.
Interesting. But you were studying piano
on the side, right? Exactly.
On the side.
Actually, I'll go into a little more detail.
Yeah, please.
I ended up going to Portland for my senior year of high school. Actually, my junior and senior year combined, because this fabulous teacher I'd had from Interlochen Arts Academy had moved out to Portland, and I wanted to go back and work with her. I knew instinctively at that age that she was the one who had the information that could get me where I wanted to go, to learn how to be expressive and how to communicate and think theatrically about music. So I did my last year in boarding school at the one boarding school in Portland, Oregon, which was then called Oregon Episcopal School. In fact, it still is. It's a wonderful school, very, very academically forward. And I was challenged all the time academically. And then I stayed on because I hadn't learned what I felt I needed to learn from Joan Brown, long deceased, brilliant teacher, piano teacher. So I stayed, and I chose Reed just because it's the best school in Oregon and in Portland, and probably one of the two best schools on the West Coast, that and Stanford, Those are the two great schools.
An excellent philosophy school.
So I knew that's where I could learn the most academically and grow in the process, because as a pianist, I'd already learned musically mostly what I needed to learn. I mean, technically, and a general sensibility approach to music. But I knew that the school could give me a level of analysis and languages, and just the school prides itself on teaching people how to think, analytically.
Right.
So I thought that's something that could really hold me in good stead for the rest of my life in every way.
Absolutely.
So that's why I ended up in Oregon. Yeah.
Your early music education was in Michigan.
In Michigan, yeah.
And what about Michigan is I mean, what was the music scene like there? I
was a kid, what do I know?
Yeah.
As a teenager, my mother was dying of cancer, so I took unusual refuge in music, which that became where I could put all of my heart and my soul. And even as a kid with an imperfect technique, music can hold that. Chopin can hold anything. Brahms can hold anything.
Yeah.
Mozart can too, but in a much stricter framework. So it just became the one place where I could actually be myself and invest myself. So then when my mother died, then I just went whole hog and went full steam forward, and then went to boarding school in it, and then continued on in that, because it was
Traverse City, right?
Interlochen, Michigan, near Traverse City. And it became my refuge, as I must say, and it's remained that way forever.
How early did you go into that? How early did you go in?
I remember Leonard Price saying that, make friends with your voice, because it's the one friend that will never let you down. If you treat it properly.
I like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not exactly true. At a certain age, your voice will let you down in some ways, but not necessarily. Because I remember her calling me on her, I called her on her birthday. I think maybe it was in her late 70s. I can't remember, 79th birthday or something. And I said, so, Ms. Price, how are you doing? And she said, oh, Maestro. She said, I'm doing great. She said, I just got out of the shower where I sang Queen of the Night up a half a step.
Wow.
And I thought, well, her voice certainly did not let her down,
no,
because she always treated it properly.
Right. So
yeah.
Well, I want to sort of work into how you came into collaboration with these great singers. So you were studying, and you didn't take a master's degree, right?
No.
Or did you? No,
I did not.
But it says you have that you list Jeffrey Parsons and Jacqueline Dupres as mentors to you.
Definitely.
What would you say you learned from them, or what was the course of study like with them?
Well, what happened is, at the end of Reed, I got a grant from the Watson Foundation to fulfill a project that I designed. They considered it a reward for having done good work, both in academics and outside extracurriculars, of which music was. So I had planned a project that I would go to England and study with all these great musicians. So the first person I had gone to, the person at the top of my list, was this incredible pianist, Clifford Curzon. So any pianists out there know his work. I mean, one of the great artists with the most beautiful sound and wonderful approach. So I got there and I called him, and he said, oh, Neal, he said, my wife just died recently. He said, I've canceled all of my concerts and I can't see anybody. And I said, well, do you know when you'll be able to see people? He said, it's going to be years. So anyway, so that was out. So then I wrote my other favorite pianist from an even older generation. He used to go by Solomon. The name was Kuttner Solomon, but he used to go simply by that one name, like Beyonce. So I managed somehow, I don't know how, I did a lot of detective work. Research was something I was always good at. I got an address for him and wrote him and told him I'd come to London. He was my idol. He was one of my idols. Said I'd love to be able to play for him and learn from him. So he eventually wrote back and he said, I've been a recluse for 40 years and that's not going to change. I stopped playing 40 years ago. So I don't know why I was attracted to these recluses. Anyway, so then I thought, I'm here in London. Who are my favorite musicians? So Daniel Barenboim was one, and he still is, brilliant pianist. So I went to audition because I read that he was doing auditions for a master class he was giving for the South Bank Festival. And so I played for him. There were, I think, 5 finalists, and I was one of the 5. And he chose somebody else, an Israeli pianist who's had a brilliant career. And I was the alternate. And so he at least gave me a couple minutes of his time. And I said, well, I came to London to study. I want to study with you. Hopefully you can get me to the next level because I love your artistry. And he said, first of all, Neal, I don't teach. Second of all, I live in Paris now. I don't live here in London. He said, what I would advise for you is to study with my wife, Jacqueline Dupres. I said, well, she's one of my idols as a musician, artist. And he said, well, here's her number, and drop her a note and then give her a follow up with a call. And I always loved her playing because there's no one more emotionally available in their playing, even now. There's never been anyone so sort of open and generous emotionally. So I wrote her, and she contacted me, or maybe her secretary did, I don't remember, and said, come to my home, this address, Knightsbridge Mews, on such and such a day and such a time. So I did, and I sat down with her. She was already in a wheelchair because, as you know, she had multiple sclerosis and had to quit performing. So she was not old, maybe 40 at the very most,
right.
Probably in her 30s still. And so from her wheelchair, she said, Neal, I'm perplexed why you want to work with me. She said, I'm not a pianist and never have been. I do teach, but I only teach cellists. And I said, well, there are a few reasons. First of all, your husband recommended it. But I said, more importantly, I want to be able to understand your sensibility, your musical sensibilities, how you approach music, how you think about it. I said, I don't need you to teach me technique. I either have it or I don't at this point.
Right.
But I really want to see how you think about music and learn about that. And she said, well, in that case, fine, because I could really do that. So that's what she did. And it was always about mining the emotion of the music, the most, that ringing as much as you can out of any passage. And I remember the first time I played for her, she said, Neal, one thing you've got to know is part of this illness is that my long-term memory is not good. And she said, even my longer short-term memory is not good. She said, so I cannot remember by the end of the movement what you were doing at the beginning of the movement. I can't help prioritize, and I can't take notes either because my hands can't write. She said, so I'm going to have to stop you at every moment that anything occurs to me and work that out. And the musical architecture is going to be up to you to accomplish and work out. And she said, if that's a deal, if you can work that way, we'll do it. So we did. And it was great. I think I was with her every week for, I don't know, 2.5 years, the entire time that I was there.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, it was really extraordinary. So Jeffrey Parsons was also on my list because I just loved his sound. There's still nobody with a more beautiful piano sound than Jeffrey, who, as you know, was sort of the successor to Gerald Moore, South African pianist. So I worked with Jeffrey a lot. And actually, that's where I met Dan Saunders, who I mentioned earlier, Craig Rutenberg. All these people have gone on, had really, really great careers. But I went to Jeffrey as a soloist. And he wasn't a soloist. I mean, he was the greatest collaborative pianist of his time. So I remember one day I came in and he said, I've been thinking that I think you would be a much happier person as a collaborative pianist rather than as a soloist. He said, your personality is collaborative in every way. He said, the life of a soloist would entail practicing 8 hours a day, giving your concert, at the end of the concert, being alone in your hotel room, and if you've got a keyboard, practicing to fix whatever you didn't like about what you just done, and then move on to the next city, and not talking to other people, basically, not interacting with them in a meaningful way for months at a time. He said, I think even if you were to have that sort of success, you'd be miserable. Mm-hmm. So I think the life being a collaborator is what you should do. And he said, I've spoken to Jackie Dupres, and she agrees with me. And this is no reflection on your piano playing, though at the time I didn't. I took it as a reflection on piano playing. There was no way not to. Of
course.
He said, I think you could have a great success as a collaborative artist. So I thought about it, and he was right. I mean, clearly he was right. So then I moved to being an accompanist, and that's what I did for the next decade or so.
I want to just circle back about Jackie Dupres and ask a question of ringing out music, ringing out every single musical phrase. And what I wonder is, how do you do that without becoming sentimental or without becoming overwrought?
Well, it was overwrought. There's no question about that. I mean, everything about her approach to music making and what she was encouraging me to do was overwrought. But come on, I just graduated from college. I was 20 years old. So it was my temperament to just really be out there. And she wanted to encourage me to be fully vulnerable and give at all times, and to develop a collaboration actually with the composer. So to know between what I felt I needed to communicate about me in relation to what the music could hold or can hold in a valid way.
Now,
So
is that about extremity of dynamic? Is it about like the use of vibrato? How do you ring out in a sort of technical way?
all of that, all of
All
that.
of it.
I mean, so there'd be a lot of analysis. We did a lot of analysis, which I had done with my former teacher in Oregon. After we would identify what the music is expressing, we'd go to the score and say, so what about the score is giving us that impression? So it could be the goal of the phrase was this diminished seventh chord, or whatever, or you'd be led to believe that it's going to have this huge forte, this crescendo to a huge forte arrival, and suddenly it would dissipate. It would be a pianissimo. So, and what that meant emotionally and musically. So I think that's what I communicate in my book. I was already taught to think that way. And Jackie just went further with it. And she said, don't second guess yourself, go all the way. Better to have an honorable failure than to be safe.
Right. I think very much, I mean, obviously there's connections to the, brevity of the life, but I always think about Jacqueline Dupres and in the same space as Lieberson. Lorraine Hunt Lieberson.
There's a emotional nakedness.
And yeah, it for me, both of them have a quality. I mean, it is fully open and has this beautiful open-heartedness to it, but to me, it never cloys. It never feels oversaturated. There's a kind of musical playing that just feels indulgent and in a masturbatory way, for want of a better word, where the only person that's getting satisfaction out of the experience of the music is the person performing it. And neither of those people, had that quality. It felt in a way like the gesture was more about being willing to say, the most vulnerable thing to the audience, rather than, be self-protective and say the most indulgent thing or something.
Yes, you have to commit 100%.
Yeah.
That's for sure. And it's about the music, and it's about how the audience receives it.
Right.
So it's less about you than about the music and the way the audience receives it. It's funny you should mention Lorraine, because I did work with her. We did a very memorable concert in Aix-en-Provence, I remember. And at my first rehearsal, I was playing as I always do. And at the end of the first piece, she said, "Neal, let's talk." And she said, you're giving full commitment to the way you feel this piece goes. And she said, I don't feel the way that the piece goes this way. Mm-hmm. She said, can you try and click into my way of thinking? And she said, so develop antennae in a different way than what you're doing. And she said, so don't just listen, but try and feel the way that I'm feeling. Mm. Which was not easy, but it held me in great stead, especially working with Kathleen Battle later on. And it turned out to be a brilliant concert. I was really happy about it. And because it was so challenging, but it worked really well. And in fact, just weeks before she died, she called me on the telephone, because this is all, again, before computers. And she said, I've just been going through old tapes. And she said, I listened to that concert we gave, and I just think it was so wonderful. And I loved working with you. And she said, did you listen to the recording? You'll hear in this Debussy song, you can hear the birds singing, because it was an outdoor concert. She said the birds started to sing while we were doing our thing. And she said, I think it's a tribute to the two of us. So, I mean, she's a lovely person, but it was a challenge because she too was committing 100%, but her sensibilities were very much divergent from mine. But we did find a way to connect and actually do the dance together.
How many times do you feel like you can, or how many times working with a singer do you feel like it takes before you can really sink into their, some shared sense of artistry? Is it something that immediately happens, or does it take, 6 recitals together, before you find some symbiotic relationship?
It depends on the person and their sensibilities. With Kathy Battle, it took quite a long time. With Leontine, actually, it was really easy because I remember in our first rehearsal, at the end of whatever the first piece was, she said, Maestro, she said, that's not what I'm looking for exactly. She said, I don't want to be accompanied. She said, I don't want to feel like you're accompanying me from the next room. She said, nor do I want to feel like I'm being supported on a cushion of sound. She said, I have a grand voice. She said, I want to be surrounded by sound at all times, like an orchestra. And I said, oh, you're sure? And she said, definitely. And so I did it. And she said, yes, that's it. That's it. That's it. I said, I've always been afraid of this because I remember working with one singer whose name I won't mention, had said to me, Neal, you're giving too much. And I said, giving too much sound? And he said, no, too much personality. I thought, how do I give less personality? So I reported that conversation to Leontine, and she said, baby, the more you give, the more I like it. She said, just go for it all the way. So she's the one who really made me the artist who I am today, that she encouraged me to such a level. I actually sought out people, or who knows, I was just drawn to people and they were drawn to me who did that sort of thing. Being a very careful, cautious artist is not who I am. And therefore those relationships never worked well.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I was always impactful about you telling me about your collaboration with Leontine was a sort of sense of centered ability to understand when it was time for her to transition into another part of her career, that there was such a sense of self-knowledge that she knew when a part of her voice was changing, and that meant it was time to stop, doing a certain role, or it was time to stop opera altogether, or it was, in that sense. And I find that's one of the rarest qualities in musicians that achieve a truly top tier level of success, because whoever wants to walk away from glory like that?
Well, it was all for her. It was all about, and I'm sure it still is, about serving the music and doing justice to the music. So I remember I was playing for her I think it was a David Garvey's memorial, who had been her former pianist. And and in the car on the way back to her apartment, I said, you're doing I said, can you tell me about this version of the music you're doing? And she said, what are you talking about? And I said, so I opened up the score and I said, you're doing this instead of what's written. And she said, oh, I'm so ashamed. And she said, how can you ever respect me again? She said, I thought I was doing it right. I thought, here, Leontine Price is asking how I can respect her again. She said, well, now you're going to have to pay. She said, show up at my home tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. and you got to pound it into my head till I get it right, because now it's in there wrong. And she said, I'm so embarrassed that I've performed this so many times wrong. She said, the music deserves much better than what I've done. So then when it came time to transition in her career, it was all about, and it was not about her, it was about if her sound was actually giving proper justice to the music. So she did occasionally ask me to transpose, but unlike other people, she asked me to transpose up, because she felt her glory zone was at the top and it was the easiest. Her tessitura was getting higher and higher. And when she ultimately decided to stop, it was because she had listened to some recent recordings of our recitals. And she said she didn't recognize the color of her middle voice, and she didn't feel it was what the music deserved any longer. So that meant it was time for her to stop singing. So it was not about ego, it was about the composers.
It's quite remarkable. I mean, Yeah, it's really special.
She said, I've had the career that I've wanted, and I have nothing to wish for, so that's okay. She said,
Wow.
and I remember like a week later, I called her and asked her how she was doing. I was imagining her being all depressed. And she said, oh, Maestro, everything's great. And she said, don't have to turn on the she said, I can turn on the air conditioner when I want now. And she said, I go outside when I feel like it, and I don't have to worry about the pollen. And she said, life is good. And she said, I'm watching TV and listening to my old recordings, which I never had the luxury of doing while I was performing. She said, but now I have the time to listen. And she said, and I can see what the hullabaloo was about. So she had the career that she wanted and had no regrets whatsoever.
Remarkable. So I want to ask a little bit about identity change, because you are somebody who has had many, and many evolutions in your own career, solo pianist to collaborative pianist to conductor to impresario, and all of these things, you don't ever abandon one of these right. parts of yourself.
I've rarely jettisoned anything.
But what I wonder is what are those transition moments like? Because you had said, Bernstein had encouraged you to be a conductor, but there is something that's challenging if you come to think of yourself in a certain way, about making a leap into another part of your, another skill set or another identity within the industry. And I wonder how you've thought about that in your career.
Well, I've actually never thought about it, but I'm sure you could relate to it as well as I can. It takes a sense of courage and a sense of self-knowledge that I'm already good at this. So let me see if I can become good at this at X as well. Mm-hmm. So you've got to have enough self-confidence that what you've done before is valid, and then enough self-confidence to at least believe, I don't know if no is the word, but to believe that you can actually channel that into something else and grow in another way, that you've got enough of a skill set that you can learn to expand yourself in any number of directions. I always thought it was a weakness of mine that I enjoyed doing so many things. I enjoyed playing the piano, I enjoyed teaching, I enjoyed lecturing, I enjoyed conducting. I enjoyed writing a little less, but there you go. I enjoy thinking about music and making music and however I can be of use. And I always thought that was a weakness until the lockdown, until the pandemic, when all of a sudden I couldn't conduct because there are no live performances, and I still had to make a living, but I could call upon all these other skills that I had developed in my life and work it. So I feel good about that, but I think it all comes down to having a sense of self-confidence. It's the same with singers. If the singers feel confident in their abilities and what they can do, they're willing to try something new. If they feel on some level that they found what works for them and they can't let that go in any way, then it's useless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel that very much. I find it, I've always found the way that I've always thought about it is less about, is to walk away from any kind of language about failure. It's like if I stop doing this, it's because I failed at it, and more to see life as a series of experiments or iterations. So saying, well, I did this and I've gained so much information from doing it, even if, I felt that way personally as a singer, is like, well, there's elements about this that I, on one hand, I don't think I would have been able to do it professionally because of my instrument. But I also know that I didn't have the psychological framework to do it. But the act of learning how to do it was one of the most valuable things I've ever done. And
you could parlay that in other directions.
It informs everything. And if that's the way that you see all of life, then it becomes a much easier way to become cumulative instead of a series of failed adventures or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that.
No, I think life is about growth, and if you can see it that way. And even if you fail, you've grown.
Yeah.
I mean, but what is failure? I think that's something that's imposed in a way, and it's judgment that you don't want to have.
It's also somehow inherent to, it seems, the act of gaining a musical skill set. There's something about a certain kind of pedagogical approach that is about correctness or something like that. And if you don't do it correctly, you failed. Yeah,
I always say that failure is a ladder to success.
Yeah.
So in my classes at Manus, I ask people to do these things that are really, really hard. And they look at me with a sense of horror because I want them to do it in front of the rest of the students.
Right.
At this look of horror. And I say, come on, you're in a safe place. And this is a safe place to fail. And if you can't do it, that's fine. I won't think any less of you because I think you're terrific. And the other singers in the class will be able to relate to this because I'm going to ask them to do something that's beyond their comfort zone as well.
Right.
So I would say 3/4 of the time with the invitation that it's okay to fail, then they're able to do it to whatever I ask for. That's something outside of their comfort zone. And then they're totally shocked and that they can do this thing. But so then I've raised the bar for them and I'll keep on raising it all the time. And so they feel a sense of satisfaction and I do too. But I think we need to apply that, to have the courage to apply that to our own lives too. I
agree. I think, there's so much here that I feel like I could do another hour, but I want to be mindful of your time and just hit a few more topics quickly. I'm always interested in the moments before big moments. So in 2000, you started Henry Street Chamber Opera, and I wonder what was happening in 1999 that made that happen for you, that just pushed you in the energy to say, this is something that I want to bring into the world.
Opportunity and frustration. I had already decided that I was going to conduct at the behest of Bernstein. And then when he said, Neal, you're really a conductor, you need to take this recommendation seriously, I thought, musically, I know he's right, but what's holding me back? And I thought, just psychological aspects, ideas, limitations that I perceived limitations were holding me back. So then I went to therapy for like 2 years until that was an issue mostly of the past. Things never leave you entirely, but it wasn't so prevalent. So then I decided to do it and I couldn't get work. I mean, people just, say you're a conductor and people say, okay, come and conduct for us because there's a lot at stake on their side. And most places knew me as a pianist. I mean, all these really great companies, they say, well, we know you as a pianist. We don't know as you as a conductor. So once you've done some conducting, then come back and we'll talk. So I thought, how is this going to happen? So you just got to keep on planting lots of seeds, and then you sow what you reap with any luck. So the first thing that I was able to sow was I got a gig conducting some Gilbert and Sullivan. I think it was Gilbert and Sullivan for a now defunct company in Connecticut, New England Lyric Operetta, where even though I don't really like operetta, I certainly didn't admit that at the time. But I thought it could teach me something because you can. It's really, really hard to conduct, by the way.
I know, I would see it's just like Rossini somehow, there's something very similar.
It's all rubato and you have to know exactly what the singers want. You've got to give the orchestra what they need.
You have to have comedic timing. You have to really be able to land the punchline.
Right, and on top of that, there are a lot of things where you've got to land dialogue where you're underscoring the dialogue and you've got to end at the same time. So you've got to listen at the speed at which people are talking and then go along, either slow down or speed up so that you come boom on the end. So a lot of technical stuff. Anyway, so I got that gig and I started to grow. I was doing well, but then I wasn't feeling that I just knew that I needed more time in front of a band. So that sort of corresponded with a time when the woman who was heading music at the Henry Street Settlement called me and she said, there's this incredible concert hall here do you know about it? And I said, no. And she said, nobody knows about it. And she said, come and look at it. It was then called the Harry de Jour Playhouse. And she said, it's 300 seats, lovingly restored, Adams style. She said, you should come and do some opera here. And so I looked at it. I came on downtown and looked at it. It's fabulous, fabulous place. And so she said, you should start an opera company here. And she said, you could do brilliant reductions of the big Verdi operas and of Carmen and things like that. And that did not sit well with me. Also because I wanted to do what the composers had actually written. The composers had not written reductions, they'd written big operas. And so we already had the Met, we had New York City Opera, and they were both doing really good productions of these pieces the way that they should have been done. And then there were some companies doing reductions like Amato Opera, long defunct, but I didn't want to be another one of those. And then I started to think about chamber opera, which at that time no one was doing, really no one was doing. And basically that meant almost any opera before the 19th century, and a lot of operas and some in the 18th century too. So though Mozart did write for big orchestras, a lot, but not everything. So I started thinking about that repertoire, which is really underrepresented and could be done properly and really well in a small space and with a smaller budget, and some contemporary operas that were chamber operas. And so that's how I decided that would be the mission of the company, was to present these things and do it well. Just one more point about that. I managed to corral my friend Christopher Alden into directing our first production because I wanted to start out with a bang. And
that's quite a bang. Yeah.
Christopher's a really wonderful musician and wonderful artist, as well as being a wonderful director. He's got real insight into the score and what's going on behind it. So it was asking me about my philosophy. And then as in now, I said, the only thing worse than no opera is bad opera. And I really agree, because that really turns people off, and then we have no audience whatsoever. Yes. So he said, well, you have no budget. And I said, no, but we will have a budget. I said, I want you to look at this piece, tell me what is the least amount of money we can pay for each of your designers to come up with a production that you can be proud of and you think will do justice to the music. And I said, once you've decided that, that's the money that I'll raise, or we won't do it. So there you go. So wow. That's what we did.
Unbelievable. I think, I mean, one of the things that I've always found so remarkable is that, it was so prescient, the existence of, the sort of genesis of Gotham, especially, or Henry Street and then Gotham. Mm-hmm. But now, you fast forward 20 years and New York City Opera is no more. And instead you have the Met, which is, current moment aside, a $300 million enterprise. But largely, there's only that, or people that are operating at, minimal budgets, because, they somehow there is no middle for high quality, well done productions, that represent anything but chamber opera,
Yeah, the budget has got to fit the ambition.
Yeah.
So if your ambition is to do Aida, a Met size Aida, you shouldn't do it in a 300-seat theater,
right,
with 50 cents.
Yes.
So you've got to have the scale down your ambition. I mean, scale down is the wrong word. You've got to make your ambition fit the budget, right, and make the budget fit the ambition.
Right. Well, you understand that if you do Aida and, if you do La Boheme, you are doing it in dialogue with, Zeffirelli. And so if you scale down the Zeffirelli production, it'll always be a bad Zeffirelli production.
Exactly. I mean, so it reminds me, when I was a student in London, I befriended a guy who was a hairdresser at Harrods. And I remember him saying to me one day that this Texan dowager had come in, and he said she had 3 hairs and she was demanding that I make a beehive out of it.
Right.
And I thought, the image was just so palpable. I thought that's
Yes.
what people are trying to do in opera. You can't do Aida on a shoestring. You can't do Otello on a shoestring, nor should you try, in the same way that this woman should not be asking for a beehive if she had only 3 hairs.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. That is quite a vivid image.
Isn't it though?
It will stay with me.
Yeah, me too.
So one thing again, shifting directions, is there a general part of the repertoire that you go, this is overrated, I don't want to touch this, this is not interesting to me intellectually or musically?
No, I'm afraid I've got very Catholic tastes. I mean, I love almost everything. I mean, there are some pieces that don't speak to me. Like many people's favorite opera is Turandot, which is something I can't bear. It just seems to be loud, relentlessly loud and overblown, and the emotions don't ring true to me. I think it's just pumped up in a lot of ways. It seems insincere. Though if you want pumped up, I mean, you can't do it any better than that.
Right.
It's just very Hollywood 1950s in a way. But no, by and large, I can click into most sides of the most corners of the repertoire because most of them come out of an intimate, genuine expression.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there might be some 20th century, late 20th century pieces, 1960s, 1970s, that are more about the technique and of composition and meant more for the colleagues than for an audience, and where the emotional content is secondary and really not welcome in any way. I even talk about that in my book, because I was talking to one of the great contemporary music singers, Lucy Shelton, about this. I was talking to her about the emotional content of various things that she'd done and had great success with. And I said, so do you identify the emotional content? And she said, emotional content is not what it's about, and it's really unwanted. It will get in your way. She said, just do what's on the page, and that's enough. That doesn't really interest me, just doing what's on the page.
Yeah.
So that there are plenty of people who can do that much better than I, and so I leave them to that. Though I must say, I have done it on occasion, and I've learned a lot how to do it, but I've not learned in any way that really appealed to me on a deep level.
And I want to end sort of by asking it's more of a philosophical question, but it was something that your friend and mine, Paul King, sort of asked me the other day when we were on the phone. I found it to be a really intriguing question. And it has to do with sort of what is the inherent operatic quality of any single piece of composition, because right now our project, your project, Catapult Opera, is engaged in a series of commissions that is about expanding what this word means in terms of repertoire and bringing in voices that wouldn't traditionally be associated with the operatic idiom, but the prompt that we're giving them is write something
that you consider operatic.
Yeah.
Right.
And so what I wonder is, what is that? What is that to you? Is it about instrument? Is it about complexity? Is it about just statement?
No, it's something, I mean, my personal reason for doing this is I want to explore this concept. It's not something I have a fixed answer for, but I believe it's about communicating a genuine emotion, not necessarily bigger than life, but an emotion that's the size of life. That others can relate to. And there's lots of ways of doing it. I think that rock and roll can do it, jazz can do it. There's any number of ways. Certainly rhythm and blues, that's what it's all about. Because I was recently talking to a friend of mine, a former Gotham singer, brilliant singer, and she was feeling something or other. And she said, oh yes, this is just like this Beyonce song or whatever. And she said, so it's not just classical music that you can tap into and that reflects our emotions. So I'm just looking to see how these other genres or subgenres interpret operatic, which to me is about exploring, mining your emotions and communicating them through music.
Yeah, absolutely. I always find it interesting, I think I was listening to the biographer, composer Jan Swafford talking about Monteverdi, talking about the origins of classical music and saying, what's radical is you take a story and you set it to music. It's that simple yet radical experiment.
But if you listen to the earliest things, the Florentine Camerata, it's heightened speech, and that's really what it is.
It is.
And then the more heightened the emotion is, the more heightened the speech is, and the more heightened the song is. And that gives rise to huge range and all of these other things, which then gives rise to vocal technique, but to fit the musical requirements.
Right. And in my mind, when I think about that, as I go to, well, what is the genre right now that tells story, in a way that is channeling that kind of spirit. And I think about country music, or I think about the ballad, a ballad song like that kind of, that sensibility. And you go, well, origin, that whatever is inherently operatic now, of course, lives in all genres because it sort of got there first, you know.
Well,
But
let me relate for a second.
yeah.
When I was working with Pavarotti many years ago, obviously he's been gone for a long time. He told me that he loved country music. And I was sort of astonished by this because everything is so different. He said, no, Maestro, think about it. He said, I got acquainted on this through meeting Dolly Parton on the Johnny Carson show. And he said, so I had an open mind. He said, my mind was open because I found out the sort of sums she was making in her performances. So he said, I then realized she's got such a huge audience. So I've got to see what appeals to them. He said, but it's this rawness of emotion. And he said, if you listen to any country song, it starts with the recitative and then it moves into the aria, and the aria is cathartic and then it's over in 3 minutes. He said, it's basically opera, but just in different dressing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot about that. I mean, Pavarotti is such a shrewd artist. I'm working on a project right now about the Pavarotti and Friends era, you know, that sort of post three tenors, you know, dip into.
I think it was pre three tenors.
Pre three tenors, yeah, that's right.
Because I was the rehearsal pianist for that.
Oh, were you really?
Yeah.
Well, then I should be talking to you about it. But just sort of as a, you know, conceptual idea of like these concerts where, you know, he'd bring in whatever famous pop singer of the moment and have them sing O Sole Mio, and he would sing a verse of it, and then he would sing a verse of one, you know, something standard with Liza Minnelli, and there's this sort of exchange of style and idea, and there's something that was so, you know, I guess purist would look at it and go, this is pandering, or this is not what it is about. But
it's what high art is.
The spirit behind it is about connection. How do you bring all of these things closer together? How do you connect to the largest group of people that you can, which I think is a very admirable thing. And I think, you know, opera probably should do a lot more of, you know, really make attempts to draw these connections, to draw the parallels, and to find a way to reach an audience that doesn't always have the, you know, whatever the necessary prerequisites are for appreciating.
Yeah,
they need a path in.
We've got to look for the commonality.
Yes.
And human experience is the commonality, and human motions is the commonality, but it's developed in different ways. All these different genres have developed in different ways, as has classical, certainly, and opera. So the other day I attended a lecture, you know this already, by our mutual friend Will Berger from the Met, because it was about the intersection of metal, formerly called heavy metal, and opera. And I thought, well, that's weird. What sort of intersection could there possibly be? And then it was really enlightening for me that what sort of intersection there is. And it's sort of obvious, but I'd missed it because the superficialities of it just seemed so opposite. So once I realized that philosophically and intellectually how much clear overlap there is in the general approach and what's behind the creative spirit in both these genres, that's when I called you up and said, so what do you think about us commissioning somebody who has some classical background who is a experienced metal artist and songwriter? And you were all for it, so that's what we've done. I'm looking for the commonality between what old fogies like myself consider opera and what these other genres are doing that they consider operatic. And I don't really have the answers, but I think we'll have to see the results and analyze it as we go. I
love that. I think it's a beautiful project. And I think not having the answers is in fact, you know, the only way to sort of go about it. Mm-hmm. It's all a big grand experiment, and it's all about expanding these definitions.
I mean, who's got the answers? Nobody's got the answers for anything.
Yeah, especially not now.
Exactly, especially today, right?
Yeah. So. Well, I think that's a great place to sort of wrap it up. So much great information, and I feel like there's entire sections that we didn't even get to talk about, but maybe we'll do another one of these.
As you wish, but I've had a lot of fun. Thank you for this.
It's been excellent. Thank you.